Hi, welcome to part 1 of my review featuring Treacherous Traps, the definitive guide to creating traps, hazards, and puzzles for your fantasy adventures. This book may very well be the only trap book you will ever need throughout the course of your entire gaming career. It is designed for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. However, because of that, it is compatible with other editions of Dungeons & Dragons, any D20 based system, pseudo-clones, retro-clones, and I would say it's also quite easy to modify some things to adapt it to other fantasy systems. And when it comes to genre and theme, I also think it's very easy to use it in perhaps science fantasy role-playing games. Now let's talk about the quality of the PDF. The quality is great. Everything is well written, organized, and explained. You have bookmarks for every section of the book, so it's going to be very easy for you to move through the entire document. There are also hyperlinks in the table of contents. The graphic design and illustrations look amazing as well. They feature that theme of fantasy mechanisms, many gears and cogs, and the illustrations display all sorts of fantasy scenarios. So overall, the quality is excellent. Now, let's talk about the content. First, we have an introduction to what this book is. This is for game masters, but I would also say that this book is going to be gold for solo role players and co-op role players. That is, those of you that play without a game master, because of the tools contained here. Not only do you have many different traps and variety of mechanisms that present obstacles and hazards for the party of adventurers, you also have a random trap generator, many tips and advice on how to use these mechanisms, and you could also make your own tables to roll simple traps, complex traps, and adapt them to your co-op and solo games. After the introduction, you have an overview of the entire book. The first chapter has to do with how to use the traps. It's a brief introduction. When it comes to chapters 2 to 6, it's all about simple traps for all levels of difficulty, that is from level 1 of experience to level 20. Then you have information on complex traps, then on how to design traps of all sorts. Then we have the random trap generator, tips and advice on how to build a trap-centric dungeon, how to create perplexing puzzles. You also have secrets, ridiculous riddles, and the last chapter of the book even contains a new player background, the Trapsmith, who begins the journey with a new kind of tool, Trapsmith tools. After that brief introduction, we have information on how to use traps. Each trap entry contains the following information: the type of trap, maybe it's mechanical or it's a magic trap, the trap's level range, the lethality, and any purpose keywords, a description of the trap providing its general layout and position, and the trigger. This is what activates the trap. You also have information on the effect of the trap and countermeasures. Now, when I say that these traps are pretty good, in fact excellent for solo and co-op adventures, is because of the way they are organized. First, you have a description of the trap without revealing anything concerning the inner workings, how everything activates, how your character is affected negatively by the trap as it is being sprung. So if you create your random table, or if you use some random way to determine what trap you encounter during each section of your solo adventure or co-op adventure, it's going to be very easy for you to just read the description of the trap, come up with some creative solutions on how to bypass it, and then you can read the rest of the information to see if you manage to overcome the trap, disarm it. This also involves a heavy dose of role playing rather than role playing. That is, it's going to reward you when you come up with some immersive ideas on how to disarm these mechanisms or overcome them in some way. And if you decide to use these traps for solo and co-op games, I would recommend that you use them to guard some passageway, some area of access to another section of the dungeon of the adventure site, or perhaps these traps could serve as obstacles or gates to be placed before some cache or room or chest that contains some magical item. That way, if the player characters overcome this trap, they will get their hands on those items or they will gain access to that other section. But if they fail, they will suffer the consequences and the adventure will move on. Perhaps with some penalty because they couldn't bypass the trap. Maybe they lose the items for good. Maybe they manage to go to the other section of the dungeon, but they end up wounded, of course, because of the effect of the trap, or they end up teleported to some other place. It's all up to you. It depends on the way that you are handling your adventure. Next, we have some specific details, for example, trap types. There are 3 categories. Mechanical traps are where the trigger and effect are both mundane. You also have magic traps, of course. These are mechanisms where the trigger and effect are both magical, and they are usually spell traps, of course. And we have the hybrid category. These are traps where either the trigger is magical and the effect is mundane, or vice versa. Let's talk about spell traps. Many of the magic and hybrid traps described in this book could be a glyph of warding, that is a spell trap, or the symbol spell. These spells each have their own specific rules for detection and disarming. Now, when it comes to hybrid traps, these kinds of traps combine mundane triggers and magic effects, or magic triggers and mundane effects as stated earlier, and this can lead to some interesting combinations. Hybrid traps can usually be detected with wisdom, that is perception, or intelligence, arcana, and they can also be found with detect magic. You even have details on a ritual, the rune of detecting. When you cast this spell, you inscribe a rune upon a surface, such as a table or a section of floor or wall, or on an object. When the rune is triggered, it creates a tiny, invisible, mindless, shapeless force that only lasts long enough to interact with a nearby mechanical element, such as the workings of a trap, a lever, or a button. The mechanical element must be within 10 feet of the rune. Once the force interacts in this way, the spell ends and the rune fades away. Then we have details on trap level and lethality. The pre-made traps in this book are arranged by level and lethality. These are used together to determine things such as the variables of the trap, such as appropriate damage output, spell level, duration of effects, and appropriate experience reward. Let me give you more information about lethality. A trap intended to be a setback is unlikely to seriously harm characters of the indicated levels, depending on the trap, but a moderate trap likely will. A dangerous trap is likely to seriously injure characters of the indicated levels, and a perilous trap almost definitely will. A deadly trap is likely to kill characters of the indicated levels. Now, when it comes to the trap purpose, this is a keyword that describes its primary usage in the area, including the reasoning behind its placement and the overall goal of the trap. Some traps may do several things at once, but the primary purpose is reflected in the keyword. When it comes to alert, these traps notify someone or something to the presence of intruders. Block traps impede creatures from proceeding in a particular direction. Harm traps are intended to cause damage and possibly kill creatures. Hinder are traps that disable or hamper creatures, damaging their senses or imposing conditions. When it comes to subdue traps, they capture creatures alive, either by containing them physically or with magic. When it comes to the trigger and effect, a trap is easily thought of as an if-then statement. If this happens, then that happens. Triggers come in all shapes and sizes. They can be as basic as a tripwire strung across a path, but they can be more complex, such as a weight-sensitive floor, which only activates when a certain amount of weight or more is placed on it. There are 3 varieties of triggers. We have mundane triggers, which have some sort of mechanical apparatus, or it relies on things like gravity and momentum. There are ambiguous triggers. These sorts of triggers could be created using mundane or magical means, and magic traps function purely by magical means, of course. No matter the type, all triggers share a common trait. If the requirements are met, they activate. Effects come in the same three varieties that triggers do. We have mundane effects, which function via mechanical means, or they rely on things such as gravity or momentum. It's the same. Ambiguous effects could be created using mundane or magical means. And magic is also an effect that is produced purely by magic. We also have information on countermeasures. No one likes being hit with something they had no chance to see coming. When it comes to traps, it is important to always know what the characters can do to detect elements of the trap. Each trap entry will provide options like ability checks to notice elements of the trap, if necessary, ability checks to understand how the trap works and how to disable it. Different ways in which the creatures involved can slow, stop, or otherwise interfere with the trigger or effect. There's also details on that too. Not all trap triggers can be detected in the same ways, and some can be more difficult to detect than others. When it comes to detecting triggers, there are some concepts to consider when it comes to how characters detect traps in your game. For example, alternative skill usage. There may be times when using a skill with an unorthodox ability may be appropriate, depending on the task. When it comes to immersion, as a way to detect a trigger, you have the players describe what senses their characters are using to detect traps instead of simply listing the skills they have on their character sheet. You also have information on timing. Think about how much time is passing as the characters find and deal with traps. Now, when it comes to too many rolls, don't just let every player roll dice until someone detects and or disarms the trap. Have the players describe with some specifics how they are attempting to detect or disarm the trap. You also have information on trap clues. If you're designing or including traps that relate to the overall story of your campaign, such as a ritual or important location within the dungeon, make sure to leave clues sprinkled throughout the rest of your adventure. When it comes to trap lore, in some cases, a trap's trigger or effect may be extremely difficult to detect. It may be appropriate to use an intelligence check related to history, nature, etc. in order to reveal lore about the trap and its location within the surrounding area. It may be appropriate to use intelligence checks concerning history, nature, or anything else related to the trap in order to reveal lore about the trap and its location within the surrounding area. When it comes to disarming triggers, once a trigger has been detected, it usually needs to be disarmed, unless it can simply be avoided, such as tripwire. Depending on the type of trap, disarming tends to work in different ways. When it comes to mundane triggers, or ambiguous triggers that are being used as mundane, they are usually disarmed with a successful dexterity check while using thieves' tools or trapsmith's tools. When it comes to magic triggers or ambiguous triggers used as magic ones, they are usually disarmed with dispel magic. Sometimes a magic trigger can be disarmed by erasing a rune on the wall or otherwise disrupting the magic of the trap. Encourage players to be creative when dealing with traps. They may come up with a way of disabling or circumventing a trap that is not listed in the trap's entry. When players think outside the box to disarm or avoid a trap, consider rewarding them with something they can use later. Some traps are rigged to activate on a failed attempt to disarm them, no matter the result of the ability check, while other traps are only triggered if the final result is particularly low. If a character has encountered a particular type of trap before, then they may gain advantage when it comes to dealing with that kind of trap. As you can see, these are many ways in which you can handle traps in your games. You can use some or all of them. I would recommend that you attempt to use them depending on the situation. Some trap encounters or some events concerning hazards and such could take too long if they are always role-played in some way. Perhaps in some occasions, with the less damaging traps, you could just make some rolls to see if the player characters avoid them or detect them or disarm them, but with more important traps that are used to guard very important items, locations, etc., it could be a good idea to encourage roleplay and immersion to see if the players can overcome them through their own reasoning, through their own logic. You also have more specific details concerning detecting effects, Sometimes a trap's effects stand out more than its trigger. In any case, detection still often uses the same skills as when detecting triggers, though a few more skills become relevant. It all depends. Not all trap effects are hidden. Sometimes a nasty wall of spikes or a pendulum blade hanging from the ceiling in plain sight is enough to stop intruders in their tracks. When it comes to disabling effects, sometimes the only option to deal with a trap is to disable or negate its effect entirely. Wedging climbing pythons between the cracks of a trapdoor, packing dart holes with wooden dowels, affixing a bag of holding to the water inlet of a flooding chamber, the possibilities are endless. When it comes to the reset, when designing or placing a trap, it is important to consider whether the trap would be able to reset itself or not. Traps can also be used as templates. In the next part of this review, you will see pre-generated traps that are designed to be usable as possible in multiple settings and situations. But there is no reason that you cannot make changes to them to suit your needs. There is a lot of flexibility in the content of this book. Some of the traps may have slight bits of flavor, mentions of certain detection criteria, or other elements that are specific about one thing or another. You will see all of that and more in the next part. And this concludes part 1 of my review featuring Treacherous Traps. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. Thank you for watching, and thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru-RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.